No, I said you only have 20 minutes to print. I'm on mute, but no, I'm not.
Almost done. There we go.
15 minutes.
All right. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a moment here. Just want to give people a chance to get their audio settings dialed in. All right, it seems like a pretty good critical mass. So I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Before I hand it off to our panelists, I just want to cover a few technical things. First, this is Zoom webinar, which is very similar, but slightly different than Zoom meeting. The primary thing is that your cameras and microphones are muted by default, so you don't need to worry about interrupting us. But that does mean if you want to interact with anybody, if you want to interact with the panelists or with other people, you got to use the chat or the Q&A. For chat, it's going to default to hosts and panelists. So if you do want everyone to see your message, just make sure that you select everyone from the drop down there. And then if you have questions for the panelists, just pop those in Q&A, and that way we can address them towards the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Nancy Katz.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the AACRAO Caribbean Offshore Medical Schools presentation. This is based on research that was conducted by two of the AACRAO Edge fellows over the last few years, and by Rosalie Hancock, who's the lead credentials evaluator at Bellevue College, and Loida González Utley, who's the Assistant Director of Transfer Recruitment at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. They have been working for 2 years plus on this research, and you will hear more about their upcoming publication. Rosalie, it's all yours.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. First, just a little bit about us. I'm Rosalie from Bellevue College, which is located just outside Seattle, Washington. I've been a credentials evaluator there for about 6 years, reviewing both foreign and domestic transcripts.
Hi, everybody. My name is Loida González Utley. I serve as the Assistant Director of Transfer at A&M University, Corpus Christi. I have been in the foreign credentials field since 2015.
This research was conducted under the auspices of AACRAO's International Education Standards Council, or IESC. We served as research fellows as part of the IESC's fellowship program. Our advisors for this project are Nancy Katz, Director of Evaluation Service Incorporated, and Dale Goff, Director of Foreign Credential Service of America and former Director of AACRAO's International Education Services. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering today, how this project came to be, how to identify offshore medical schools, our research methodology and some interesting highlights, accreditors, agencies that evaluate accreditors, other forms of recognition, samples from our resulting reference chart of medical schools, and our recommendations. Project background and intro to Caribbean offshore medical schools. So in some ways, this project really started in the 1970s with our advisor, Dale Goff, who at the time was working at the University of Maryland, College Park. Their medical school in Baltimore had received an application from a graduate of the Caribbean, although the student was a US citizen, and the University of Maryland could not determine the status of the Caribbean medical school. Thus began an investigation of these American-style schools that has since carried over to AACRAO and the International Education Standards Council. Over the years, AACRAO has received many calls from admissions offices and even several state medical boards seeking advice on Caribbean graduates. Seeing that a deeper investigation was needed, this research was assigned by the IESC to the research fellows, Loida and myself. Initially, the goal was to create a comprehensive reference chart of offshore schools with accreditation information, but it soon became clear that understanding Caribbean accreditation was a lot more complex than the yes or no question, accredited or not. Therefore, in addition to a reference chart, we are publishing a white paper that explains the framework and key decision points an evaluator needs to make when receiving these credentials. So what makes this region so complex that it necessitated this project? Primarily, the Caribbean has an atypical medical accreditation structure that defies what most foreign credential evaluators are used to. There are national, multinational, and independent accrediting agencies that may contradict each other. There are also various other agencies, such as state medical boards, which may have their own practices for determining which schools are acceptable. How do all these many agencies intersect? And what do you need to be looking for as an evaluator?
The term accreditation is largely a US term not used elsewhere. As such, international evaluations, we are looking for accreditation or its equivalent in another country. To capture this, we crafted our definitions to be more global and represent the broader concepts rather than the procedural aspects of the US definition. As you can see on the slide, recognition is when an agency approves or disapproves a medical school or accreditor for its own purposes. Accreditation is a form of quality assurance that typically requires renewal, and it's a formal recognition by a country's Ministry of Education or its equivalent. An indigenous school is integrated with the local educational structure, designed for students from the country in which the school is located. And an offshore school is integrated with the educational system of a different country other than where the school is located. Please keep in mind that these definitions are for the sole purpose of this research.
So let's start with a simple question. What is the Caribbean? This may seem obvious since most of us can probably point to it on a map, but we had to come up with a better definition than the general area near the Caribbean Sea in order to determine what to look for, in order to determine where to look for medical schools and what accreditation or other agencies may play a role. Due to the history of colonization in this area, it is politically diverse. There are sovereign nations, British overseas territories, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and special municipalities of the Netherlands, and more. In this sense, the terms country or nation are not always the most precise when describing every administrative entity, but we will use them as shorthand throughout. Ultimately, the Caribbean can be defined as both a geographical area or a political one. First, the political definition. Within the Caribbean exists a union of 20 countries. This is the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM for short. Its purpose is to enhance economic integration, foreign policy coordination, human and social development, and security among its member nations. Not all countries in the geographical Caribbean are members, which brings us to the more geographical definition. Here's a map of most of the CARICOM member nations. You can see that in addition to islands, 3 mainland countries are also members: Belize, Guyana, and Suriname. Also Bermuda, far to the north in the Atlantic Ocean. Non-CARICOM members in the area include Aruba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico.
What do we mean by the term offshore? An offshore medical school is one that is physically located in the Caribbean. However, it caters primarily to the US and Canadian applicants rather than the local population. Offshore schools are modeled on the US system of medical education. Notable hallmarks of this are a 4-year medical program and requiring 3 to 4 years of undergraduate coursework prior to admission. They typically advertise themselves as a pathway to practice medicine in the US. A credential that is earned is typically an MD. Recently, there are more offshore schools that cater to Indian students and may award an MBBS instead of an MD. Let's take a look at some real-world examples to help you identify an offshore medical school. This is an excerpt from the admission requirements for Ross University in Barbados. You can see that the admission material are to be mailed to an office in Florida, not in Barbados. In addition, Ross University requires a prior bachelor's degree for admission. It also considers non-US or Canadian students to be international, implying that students from the US or Canada are not considered international applicants. This is an offshore medical school.
Here's another example, the University of the West Indies, also in Barbados. For admission, it does not require a prior bachelor's degree. Instead, it requires the Caribbean Secondary Education Certificate and the Caribbean Advanced Proficiency Examination. These requirements cater to applicants from the Caribbean and are integrated with the Caribbean secondary education system. This is an indigenous system and not considered an offshore school. Although the purpose of this project is to document offshore schools, we did include some notable indigenous schools to make the chart easier to reference when you are not sure what category a school falls into. In addition to the University of the West Indies, the University of Guyana is another indigenous institution that is included on the chart. Here is a slightly more complex example, Lincoln American University in Guyana. Its eligibility criteria make reference to scheduled castes and tribes and other backward classes, which are terms from the Constitution of India to designate groups of people. We also see that Lincoln specifies that Indian students must complete the National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test, which is a pre-medical entrance exam in India. Clearly, this university is targeting Indian students. We also see that Lincoln American has a number of contact addresses in India, but also in Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Sri Lanka. Despite the fact that Lincoln American caters to Indian applicants, its educational system is modeled on the US system. Here's an excerpt from their website outlining their MD program. It includes taking the US medical licensing exam and intends for students to complete their residency in the United States, not Guyana or India. This is an Indian targeted, but US system and is therefore an offshore school. In this section, we will go over our research methodology and some interesting highlights.
For our research, we began by assembling a list of possible countries that may host medical schools. We looked at CARICOM nations, but also other countries in the geographical region. From there, we looked up each nation in the World Directory of Medical Schools. This is a public database of medical schools worldwide. Important to remember is the World Directory is not an accreditor, nor does it list accreditation information. This gave us our initial list of institutions to add to the chart, although more were added as we encountered them elsewhere. The World Directory will be mentioned again, as it is heavily utilized by several agencies relevant to the licensing of physicians in the US. Some US state medical boards maintain their own list of medical schools they will accept for licensure. So we also reviewed every state and territorial medical board for a published list of approved schools. Based on the history of colonization and political diversity in the region, we also looked at agencies and accreditors in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. The Medical Council of India was included due to the presence of Indian-backed institutions. However, since this project began, the Medical Council of India was reformed into the National Medical Commission and no longer recognized foreign schools.
Each institutional website was reviewed for any salient information, including admission requirements, mailing addresses, affiliated hospitals, and more. A number of websites were no longer active, so we viewed historical versions as preserved by the Internet Archive, a nonprofit organization that records historical web content. Looking up the web domains in ICANN allowed us to see who registered the website, which revealed clues about the affiliation or ownership of for-profit schools. We then began to document which accreditation agencies were active in the region and examined each school for accreditation information. As we learned more about the complexity of accreditation in the region, we began to look at agencies that evaluate accreditors, the role their recognition plays in the US, and the process for foreign medical graduates to become licensed to practice in the US. These include the NCF MEA and WFME, which will be covered in detail later in the presentation. Here are a couple interesting highlights from our research. Early on, we noticed several schools that had unusually similar websites, different colors, but the same layout, same abbreviation convention for the URL, and in some cases, identical content. We looked up the web addresses in ICANN, which shows who registered the website. All of these schools but one had removed their identification. The one school that failed to remove their identification revealed a company called Russ Education, based in India. Per their website, they assist Indian applicants in applying to medical schools in Russia that have branched out into the Caribbean. Russ Education has many mailing addresses across the country, So from then on, anytime we found a school with an Indian address, we compared it to Russ Education, which revealed more schools affiliated with them. We do not know the nature of this relationship, but it is notated on our chart. Here's a screenshot of Lincoln American University, circa 2016. On its accreditation page, it mentions being listed in the World Directory of Medical Schools, which is not an accreditor. Likewise, they also mention that they are registered with the National Accreditation Council of Guyana. This too is arguably not accreditation, but a lower standard. We will talk more about this later. Lincoln American University has since changed this webpage to be titled Recognitions rather than Accreditation, but it still lists the World Directory of Medical Schools. The World Directory provides its own disclaimer, quote, "The listing of a medical school in the World Directory of Medical Schools does not denote recognition, accreditation, or endorsement by the World Directory of Medical Schools. It's common to see offshore schools advertise their inclusion in this directory as a form of endorsement or recognition. It is not. If you are a prospective student or receiving institution who is not familiar with the final details of these agencies, it is easy to be confused."
In total, there are 73 Caribbean medical schools listed on our chart, primarily offshore schools. The data fields include institution name and former names, location and former locations, year founded, accreditation, other forms of recognition, disapproval by accreditors or other agencies, credentials required for admission, length of program, other degrees offered, affiliated or owning companies, and additional notes.
All 73 schools on the list were checked for either accreditation or recognition by all of the agencies listed here, 22 in total. There are only 8 state boards represented, as these were the only states for which we could find a public list of approved medical schools. Although the Medical Council of India no longer exists, it is still included on the chart as historical information. Now we will cover the actual accreditors you're most likely to encounter.
The Caribbean Accreditation Authority for Education in Medicine and Other Health Professions, hereby referred to as CAMHP. CAMHP was established in 2003 under the aegis of CARICOM nations. What makes it uncommon is its function as a multinational accreditor. Typically, we see accreditation performed by a national government. However, many smaller countries in the Caribbean may not have the resources to independently conduct accreditation of medical schools. CAMHP combines the resources of these nations to provide accreditation across the region. Although it does not belong to a single government, it is the official accreditor of CARICOM. CAMHP also accredits medical schools in non-CARICOM nations. Their requirements are modeled on the LCME, which is the medical accreditor for all allopathic medicine in the United States. When viewing CAMHP's published list of assessed programs, you will see several different statuses. Not accredited and accreditation denied have the same meaning. Provisional accreditation is given to the schools that are already in operation and applying to CAMHP for the first time. Candidacy status is not accreditation. It designates new programs that are still in development and not operational yet.
CAMHP is not the only multinational accreditor we have in the Caribbean. We also have the Accreditation Commission on Colleges of Medicine, or ACCM. Founded earlier than CAMHP in 1994, ACCM is based in the Republic of Ireland. However, it does not accredit medical schools in Ireland or operate on behalf of its government. There, medical accreditation is conducted by the Medical Council of Ireland. Unlike CAMHP, ACCM was not chosen to accredit on behalf of CARICOM. They are an independent nonprofit agency. As such, they do not conform to how we generally define an accreditor, despite the use of the term accreditation in their title. Per ACCM's own website, a medical school will first apply to ACCM for accreditation. ACCM then seeks permission from that country's government to accredit the school. ACCM currently accredits 9 total schools, 8 in the Caribbean and 1 in Jordan. Of course, some countries in the Caribbean maintain their own accreditation process for medical schools. Though not universal, it is common to see a two-tiered system. The first level is often registration, which is usually the minimum required for a school to legally operate and may be more similar to a business license or charter than a peer-reviewed accreditation process. Accreditation is the next step, a voluntary process of quality assurance. This project did not review these processes in depth, and more research is needed. However, it is important to note that in some cases, the local accreditation decision conflicts with the accreditation decision of CAMHP. For more information, the University of the West Indies conducted a review of local accreditation systems in 2015. A link to their publication is provided in our white paper. Since there are so many accreditors, it is essential to take a step back and examine these accreditors themselves, especially as a number of schools have received contradictory decisions from multiple accreditors. In this section, we will go over two agencies which evaluate accreditation agencies.
First is the National Committee on Foreign Medical Education and Accreditation, or NCFMEA. This is a committee within the U.S. Department of Education. Their purpose is to review the standards of foreign medical accreditors and determine if they are comparable to accreditation standards for medical schools in the U.S. To confirm their approval, the term they use is comparable. If an accreditor is deemed comparable by the NCFMEA, there is a significant key benefit, eligibility for Title IX funding, which is U.S. federal financial aid. So if a foreign medical school is accredited by an agency deemed comparable to U.S. medical accreditation by NCFMEA, their students may be able to apply for U.S. financial aid. Indeed, several offshore medical schools in the Caribbean are eligible for Title IX. CAMHP is considered comparable by the NCFMEA, but so is ACCM. Although ACCM may not fit the standard definition of an accreditor, at the very least, it is considered comparable to one of the U.S. Department of Education. There are 4 accreditors currently represented on our charts, which are NCMFEA comparable, CAMHP, ACCM, NVAO, and the Grenada Medical and Dental Council.
Next is the World Federation for Medical Education. Like the NCFMEA, they review medical accreditors and make a determination of quality. The term they use to convey their approval is recognized. Unlike the NCFMEA, this is a non-governmental agency and does not grant Title IV eligibility. The WFME is a nonprofit agency registered under English and Welsh law, Welsh law, and also registered in France. They have offices in London, France, and the Czech Republic. Currently, there are 3 accreditors represented on our chart recognized by the WFME, CAMHP, ACCM, and the NVAO. The Grenada Medical and Dental Council has applied, but has not yet been recognized. Although the WFME is not a US-based agency, in 2024, there is an upcoming change to the process for licensing foreign medical graduates in the US, in which the WFME will play a critical role. This will be discussed in the next section. Other forms of recognition. These are agencies that do not accredit Caribbean medical schools or evaluate accreditors, but may in some capacity review the medical schools themselves for their own purposes. The Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, or ECFMG, is a private nonprofit based in the US. They play a key role in the licensing of foreign medical graduates. Although offshore medical schools are modeled on the US system, they are considered foreign for the ECFMG's definition, as they are located outside the United States or Canada. The ECFMG assesses a graduate's readiness for residency, fellowship programs, or eligibility to take the US medical licensing exam, step 3 in particular. Graduates who successfully pass and meet all other requirements will be granted an ECFMG certification. This is valuable as many US state medical boards require foreign applicants for licensure to have an ECFMG certification. Important to note is that not just anyone can apply. Applicants must come from a school approved by the ECFMG according to their own standards. Currently, the ECFMG maintains their approved list of schools they will accept in the World Directory of Medical Schools. However, there is a major change coming. In 2024, the ECFMG will require that applicants have attended a school which is accredited by a WFME recognized accreditor. There are some schools currently accepted by the ECFMG, which will become ineligible for ECFMG certification if they do not obtain the appropriate accreditation.
Licensure to practice medicine in the US is granted by states, each of which have their own requirements and application procedures. When it comes to evaluating foreign applicants, many states require the ECFMG certification. This outsources much of the work of evaluating foreign medical credentials. However, a handful of states maintain their own list of foreign medical schools approved for varying degrees of medical practice within their jurisdiction. California and Texas have the largest lists, which in some cases are utilized as a reference by other states. 28 US states participate in the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact, which provides a degree of reciprocity between state medical boards, allowing the expedited medical licensing if the applicant is licensed in another member state. The big two states who maintain their own list, California and Texas, are not members of this compact, although Texas has begun the process of joining. One of the compact's requirements is that the medical schools must be accredited or listed in the World Directory. It is notable that schools listed in the World Directory may be recognized by their local governments, but not necessarily accredited. Also included in our chart is a recognition by foreign medical boards. These agencies may be the accrediting authority for medical schools in their own country, but like the US state boards, they do not provide accreditation for any of the schools on the chart. Rather, they approve or disapprove of schools for licensure in their own countries. One exception to this is the Accreditation Organization of the Netherlands in Flanders, or NVAO. As the island of Saba is part of the Netherlands, its medical school is accredited by NVAO. The United Kingdom was included for its history in the region. We also included the Medical Council of India upon discovering the Indian targeted schools in the Caribbean. We largely included these as a second option and to reveal conflicting decisions.
Now that you've been introduced to a half dozen acronyms, let's connect the dots. We begin with the academic institution. That's our offshore medical school in the Caribbean. It may or may not be accredited by one of several accreditors in the region. Those accreditors in turn are evaluated by the NCF-MEA for US comparability and or the WFME for an international standard of quality. Separate from that sequence, the ECFMG keeps their own list of acceptable schools for its applicants for certification. Then we have the state boards, which frequently look to the ECFMG certification when licensing foreign graduates. However, some of them may look directly at the academic institution and make their own determination. This diagram changes in 2024, when the ECFMG will require its applicants to have attended a school that is accredited by a WFME recognized accreditor. You can see from this diagram why this region is so complex and why this research was conducted. Please note that this diagram does not represent a hierarchy of authority, but rather what each agency is reviewing or looking for. The question for you is, what will your institution look for when it comes to accepting credentials from these academic institutions? There's not one correct answer, as it depends on the needs, objectives, and philosophy of your organization. Rather, this project intends to provide the relevant information and decision points. For example, if you are chiefly concerned with accreditation, which accreditor? And does it matter to you if the accreditor is recognized by the NCF-MEA, the WFME, or both? Lastly, we will now provide some actual samples from our chart and general recommendations moving forward. This chart shows the school's accreditation, if any, Other agencies that recognize or approve of the school, and any agencies that have disapproved of or do not accept this school. I'll pause here briefly to give you a moment to observe the chart. So starting off, if we look at St. Matthew's University School of Medicine, you can see that the ECFMG, Florida, and New York recognize and accept their credentials in some capacity. However, California, Indiana, and Kansas do not. For the Caribbean Medical University School of Medicine, CMU, it is currently accepted by the ECFMG, but was denied accreditation by CAMHP. This is an example of a school that will be impacted by the ECFMG's change in 2024. Its graduates will become ineligible for ECFMG certification if CMU does not obtain the right type of accreditation. All Saints University in Dominica is particularly interesting. It was conditionally accredited by ACCM, but denied accreditation by CAMHP. Which one takes precedence? ACCM's decision is more recent. However, Dominica is a member of CARICOM and a signatory of CAMHP, and therefore clearly within its jurisdiction. To complicate matters further, both accreditors are NCFMEA comparable and WFME recognized. If you are evaluating this credential, you will want your institution to have a policy that can manage this situation. Lastly, St. George's University is typically counted among the Big Four, the relatively reputable offshore medical schools in the region. It has recently withdrawn from CAMHP accreditation after an unsatisfactory full accreditation exercise where it earned a probationary status. However, it is still accredited by the Granada Medical and Dental Council, the GMDC, which is NCFMEA comparable. GMDC has applied for WFME recognition, but that is still under review. This means that while St. George's is eligible for Title IV funding, that's federal financial aid, from the US government, it will also be impacted by the ECFMG's change in 2024 if the Granada Medical and Dental Council is not recognized by the WFME, or if they do not obtain another recognized accreditation. St. George's is the only school the Granada Medical and Dental Council accredits. Granada, too, is a CARICOM nation and a signatory of CAMHP. These samples include schools with local recognition or accreditation. Again, take a brief moment to observe the data. Taxila American University is registered with the National Accreditation Council of Guyana. However, it was denied accreditation by CAMHP. Taxila will also lose ECFMG eligibility if it does not attain the right kind of accreditation by 2024. Windsor University is accredited by the St. Kitts and Nevis Accreditation Board, but was also denied accreditation by CAMHP. Here we have direct conflicts between the local national authority and the multinational accreditor. Both Guyana and St. Kitts and Nevis are members of CARICOM and signatories of CAMHP. Of note is that neither local accreditor is deemed comparable by the NCFME or recognized by the WFME. This is another situation where your institution must decide which agency takes precedence.
As we reach the end, we have a few recommendations. This presentation and the corresponding white paper can be used as an informational guide when developing your institutional policy and in the process of evaluating credentials you may receive from these institutions. The white paper includes a more detailed coverage of the topics discussed today. Clearly, it is not sufficient to ask the simple question of whether a Caribbean medical school is accredited or not. With simple accreditation agencies whose decisions may conflict and those whose approval carry different weights in a US context, there are more variables than usual to consider during an evaluation. We recommend you develop institutional policy that can manage the conflicts of accreditation, considering the equity and consistency of the processes between your domestic and international applicants. As medical schools in this region are subject to frequent changes, we encourage the use of primary sources when making a formal determination regarding an applicant or student's prior education. That concludes our presentation. We thank you for joining us today, and we thank our advisors and the members of the International Education Standards Council, IESC, for the opportunity to conduct this research and for their guidance and support. If you have further interest in this topic, the white paper will be available on AACRAO's webpage on the links listed above. You can also visit accrao.org for more information about the International Education Standards Council and their fellowship program.
So that concludes our presentation. Let me go ahead and stop screen sharing here. Hi, it's me, Rosalie. Camera's on, and here's Loida. So at this point, we're really just here to answer your questions. I realize now that, we moved through that presentation pretty quickly. So if you're concerned that, you may have missed something, we're happy to reiterate anything. And also everything covered in the presentation is discussed in just as much and more detail in the white paper itself. So you can always reference that in case you're worried you missed anything during the presentation. Let's see. So Shelby has just asked, when will the white paper be available? Julia, do you want to answer that, where they can find the paper?
Sure, I'm glad to. The white paper is available now. It just went up on our website today. So if you go into accrao.org, you should be able to find it. And I'm about to drop the link in here into the chat so everyone will have it as well. So it's now
Popped it in there, Julia.
Thank you.
No problem. We have a few questions in the chat also. Go through there. So Raphael asked, he didn't get a chance to see everything, but he was interested in knowing the nature of medical schools in French territories in the Caribbean, if they're considered Caribbean offshore institutions, or if they're recognized, accredited in the same way as any medical school in Paris might be.
That's a great question. Could you give me a couple examples of the French territories you're referring to?
Rosalie, this is Nancy. One
yes.
of them is St. Martin,
Mhm.
and that is listed in there. I don't believe, if I'm not mistaken, that there are any medical schools under the authority of a recognized ministry from France for medical schools operating in any French territory islands. So if you look under St. Martin, this is listed in there, and a number of institutions are listed on the chart. Is that correct?
So basically our approach was, we looked at everything in the geographical Caribbean, regardless of its political status. And so if there is an offshore school in one of those territories, we most likely would have found it. Not every nation in the region has an offshore medical school. We were specifically looking for, though, schools that are chiefly targeting students, whether that's from the US or from India, to transition into practice in the US. So they're typically, they're not based on a French system of education. They are based on a US system. And we included every single one of those we could find, regardless of the political history or current status of the current nation. Let's see, I think there was another question. I'm curious to know how others view schools that were operating before ACCM and before CAMHP began. I guess we can put that to the chat if we have any, state board representatives or medical schools in the chat, what they were doing before. I don't personally have much information on that. I think that's an interesting point of research to follow up with for someone else, is what are agencies currently doing? What were they doing and why? I think that's a worthwhile question to answer.
To give
Go
some
ahead, Loida.
to give some background information, Rosalie is at Bellevue College, right? Which is a 2-year institution, and I am at a public 4-year institution. So our foreign credential experience did not involve medical accreditors until this research. So it kind of opened the door for that. Now, because we don't have medical branches within the organizations that we serve now, we don't have the information to say what they were using before. But as Rosalie mentioned, and as we mentioned in the research, there's a lot of information to be discovered. So this is like the basis, kind of laying down the foundation and opening the door for other potential research. Hopefully somebody that that does serve at a medical school could get involved in some of that research and try to identify what, like Kathleen, what you asked, what they were using before ACCM and CAMHP.
Let's see, it looks like we have another question from an attendee. We currently only accept CAMHP. For what reasons should we consider a school denied by CAMHP but accredited by another, such as ACCM? Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we tried to highlight the fact that this does happen. Apologies for the traffic outside. I live very close to a road. So there's a few different philosophies about which accreditor you're going to accept from this region. A common approach is to accept, you know, the indigenous accreditation system, which is CAMHP. This is by the Caribbean, for the Caribbean. With ACCM, even though it's not by the Caribbean for the Caribbean, they do seek permission from the local government to accredit that school, but not permission necessarily from CARICOM as a whole to accredit that specific school. So you've got different layers and different levels of approval. And, you know, you have to decide which is more important to you. And in our paper, we provided a few specific questions to ask yourself. So one of those questions is, does it matter to you who the authorizing authority of the accreditor is? You know, does it matter to your organization and your organization's philosophy and approach to accreditation? That what really matters is whether it's CARICOM that's authorizing this accreditor or whether it's the local government that's authorizing this third-party accreditor. In either case, you know, you're going to have to decide whose decision supersedes the other, so that you have, you know, a consistent and defensible position on that. I hope that answered your question. Let me know if there are any follow-ups. Let's see. Oh, yeah, looks like we answered that.
It appears Dale is just typing out an answer to that one you just addressed there. But that might,
Great, yeah.
It does look like it in the chat as well.
Oh yes, one more thing that we mentioned in the presentation that's relevant to this question is, you know, from a US context, both CAMHP and ACCM have arguably equivalent recognition from our own government, and also from the WFME. So, you know, you have two accreditors that, whether or not they're equivalent in their home environment, they're seen as equivalent in a US context. And so you really kind of have to look to what's happening in the Caribbean itself to distinguish between the two of them.
And another thing to take away is, you know, educational equity, ensuring, you know, as we mentioned, it's used to provide information, but ultimately you have institutional autonomy, and the information that you use, what decisions you make with it should line up with the philosophies that you are currently using for foreign credentials, to provide each student an equal opportunity for education.
Looks like we have another question. Would you say that regardless of the accrediting body, they should be reviewed and approved by the NCFMEA? That's up to you. What's interesting about the NCFMEA is they have a much shorter list of approved accreditors than the WFME. And you may have missed this part because it's a little bit tricky to catch, but the ECFMG, a US-based organization that, is the gatekeeper for foreign students wanting to finish the US medical licensing exam. Now that they're instituting accreditation requirements for their applicants, they have to decide which accreditors are we going to accept. They didn't choose the NCFMEA. They didn't choose the recommendations from our own Department of Ed. They're going with WFME. And we don't know why that is. In a practical sense, the WFME has a much longer list of approved accreditors. There's also some history there. The WFME partners with a foundation called FAMER, which itself was founded by the ECFMG. So there is kind of a connection between those agencies. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, again, that's a question for you to decide. Even just outside the Caribbean, if you're accepting a medical credential from elsewhere in the world, and you want to get some sense of what this accreditor is, probably the WFME is the most helpful place to go to at this time.
And actually, just a quick, I guess, logistical question for me. Are you fine with us sharing the slide deck today?
Yes, I will. The one that I sent you, it still has all kind of our fun little notes and scripts in there. So I'll go ahead and clean it up so that it can be nice and accessible for all of our attendees.
Sure. If I save it as a PDF, that usually scrapes out the notes on each slide.
Oh yeah, absolutely, no problem.
That's what I normally do. Okay, great. So I uploaded that. I'm going to put that link in the chat for people that want to reference the research later on. And as a reminder, this was recorded as well, so you can use the same link that you use to access this live session to watch the recording. Or if you forget it, lose it, whatever, you can just revisit the site and the link to watch the recording will be there instead. That appears to be it. Applause indeed. So everyone would be clapping if we were in a session hall.
And I would just add that if you're interested in the IESC and the Fellows Program, please find that also on ACRAO's website. And I think Rosalie and Loida would both share that it was a great experience for them.
Absolutely, I highly recommend it.
And we can't thank our mentors enough, Nancy, Dale, and the entire ESC for guiding us, showing us our research capabilities and how to dig for information and use it to guide others. So thank you for the opportunity to research with you guys and get this presentation and publication done.
Job well done.
A job very well done.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. And I'm sure that if you have additional questions, you can contact either Loida or Rosalie, or send them off to ACRAO in their international exchange, and they will be responded to.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye,
Thank you.
guys.